I want to talk about a few lessons that we learn about alliances and about building alliances. The first is that alliances emerge from common pain. And to actually begin to talk about this, I'd like to take a trip through history. 1780 was an important date in the history of the United States. By that time, the 4,000 inhabitants and residents of this country had spread themselves through 13 states. They were enjoying the fact that they had declared and won victory in their effort against England, and were in a place where they really believed that peace, prosperity was right in front of them, and they were quite in that mode. Each of these states, by the way, had drafted a constitution to protect the happiness and well-being of their people, and things were seeming to go quite swimmingly. Now, by 1786, the mood had changed dramatically. The states, by that time, had become more like foreign adversaries than they were economic partners. They were flaunting, literally, their sovereignty and had given very little of the autonomy necessary to the federal government to do anything, and they were operating under the Articles of Confederation, which had been literally penned by the Second Continental Congress. Defects began to occur. A number of states, for instance, claimed territory of Vermont, but there was no national court system to resolve those border disputes. Rhode Island had, interestingly, created a toll road that went through the entirety of Rhode Island. That was one of the major linking highways, and it had peeved a lot of the other states. Maryland and Virginia were locked in a dispute over the navigation of the Potomac River. And it was this kind of thing that began to focus on the inadequacy of the Articles of Confederation, as they literally had no capacity to deal with the monetary issues, the issues of commerce and navigation, the significant debt that they had incurred, of $60 million debt, plus they had made a pledge to all of those who had fought with the Continental Army that they would pay them half of their wages in perpetuity, but they defaulted on all of these at a national level. And so enter at that point in time the triumvirate of people that you have recognized over the course of the time since we were in junior high school. George Washington comes out of retirement. Hamilton and Madison begin this aggressive effort at trying to organize the states into a new movement. Now, all was not well with the states either. The states had become quite oppressive, and it had led to disaffection there as well. In fact, Shays' rebellion was about the commoners and farmers who were literally exerting themselves because of the lack of freedom that they felt. There was a legendary character named Plow Jogger. If you haven't ever heard of him, it's a real deal. It's actually an alias, but he arose in a tavern meeting in Massachusetts. And he said this, and I have this sense of him stepping up and rising up and saying, "I've been abused. I was forced to do more during the war than most others were. And since then, I've been subjected to taxes of every kind. Taxes because of my class, taxes from the town, taxes from the province, the continental taxes that they want to impose. I've had it. It's time for us to stop, because now the sheriffs and the constables and the collectors are constantly coming after me. They've seized my cows and sold them for less than they're worth. And the fact of the matter is, we ought to close them down. We ought to get rid of the constables. We ought to get rid of the sheriffs. We ought to get rid of the courts. We ought to get rid of lawyers." The fact of the matter is, if this guy would timed himself poorly, if he'd been here, he'd had a lucrative contract with Fox News. But he excited a lot of energy and was a key part of this rebellion that began to take place in the states. And again, you see Washington, Jefferson, and Madison beginning to organize themselves. You hear people like Eldridge Gerry saying things like, "We, if we don't do something, are going to not only disappoint ourselves, but we're going to disappoint the rest of the world as well." And so this pain that had begun to develop in the states and among those who were intellectually involved in the creation of the country was a recognition that they had to do something, and do something hard. And they commenced, as you know, the rest of the story, this series of events that started in Annapolis and then ultimately moved to Philadelphia, where the miracle that occurred there relative to the Constitution, and not with an easy kind of a thing, but under the leadership of George Washington, who kept stability and kept people at the table through these remarkable turf battles that were occurring. They come up with this miracle of the Constitution. But it was this common pain that brought this group of people together. Now, one of the important elements, one of the key intellectual scholars of this period of time, Christine Drinker Bowen, who wrote The Miracle of Philadelphia, said this, and I think this is profound and applicable. She said this was an event that occurred at the only moment when it could occur. That if it had occurred 5 years earlier, if we had been in 1780 instead of 1786, she said, we would not have had the wisdom of the drafting of state constitutions that was brought to the Constitutional Convention, and this experience and wisdom existed. She said if it had been 5 years later, the states would each have so embedded themselves in international affairs and self-interest and different divergent alliances that it would have been impossible for them to come together. And so consequently, this event occurs in this remarkable moment of time when scholars believe it was the only time it could happen, a time when this problem was huge enough to see, but small enough to deal with. And that, I think, is an important lesson for us. Principle number 2. Alliances succeed, or purposeful alliances improve efficiency and accelerate results. Now, we're all of us familiar with this notion of electronic prescribing. And in 2001, the beginnings of this electronic highway to create electronic prescribing commenced. And there were 2 entities that began at least, and there were others clearly in this tussle as well, but for purposes of this story, RX Hub was a group that was created by the PBMs, by the pharmacy benefit managers. And it was this group that was very cost conscious and was trying to drive really things on the basis of cost. SureScripts was basically put together by the pharmacies. And it was both the independent pharmacies and the chain pharmacies that were behind that effort. Now, they had approached it differently. So SureScripts had approached it from the standpoint of creating the electronic highway between doctors and pharmacies, whereas RX Hubs had done the same through prescribers and payers. And so they had very different kinds of approaches to this. It was really interesting as they began to invest in this. And about the time 2005, when Mike Leavitt becomes Secretary of Health and Human Services and begins to get involved in the interoperability issues regarding health information technology, it's at this point in time that incentives are created and the beginning of a landscape change begins to occur relative to e-prescribing in terms of the desire of the federal government to incentivize and push it. But here's the thing that was interesting. It seemed like a natural that if RX Hub and SureScript could get together, that if they could literally get themselves in a position where they could simply converge and merge their businesses, that they would continue to that they would create the loop that would make the electronic highway for prescribing complete. But there was a barrier to it. And this barrier was that the pharmacies and the PBMs literally hated each other. The retailers and the PBMs saw themselves in different places. The pharmacy saw the PBMs or the RX Hub as attempting to reduce cost and to eliminate this personal relationship between pharmacists. And the difficulty that we had relative to all of the balance here is that I'm beginning to see my timetable is really running short here, so I'm going to really accelerate my pace. But it was an impossible task to get them together. But on the other hand, what happened was remarkable. two people, John Driscoll and Bruce Roberts, began to impose this vision that they had, this remarkable vision of the good that could be done by the social and economic good that could be done if, in fact, there was this coalition that had been brought together, and they began to merge this company through a remarkable effort at bringing together two parties that really did not like each other. And at the conclusion of this event, I will just say that they didn't like each other any better. But they sat at the boardroom together, 50-50 on the board, and despite the fact that they competed vigorously and that they worked hard on the outside, that they literally found themselves in a position to create a company that was more efficient and that created an accelerated result. Now, let me quickly do this. There are principles that exist relative to alliances. And those principles are these, that you need to find the right allies, and you need to have those allies be a group of people. I was going to tell you a story of our efforts at the state of Utah, our efforts at EPA, our efforts at HHS and in the private sector that have educated us to when and how these alliances really come together and work best. And it has to do with the fact that that you are able to find the right conveners and leaders and pull them together, and that you are able to create written charters and the like. The bottom line is this, is that if you do, you are able with some degree of certainty to predict those coalitions that will succeed. If all of those elements are present, you will have the capacity to literally predict whether or not it is worth your investment of time and financial resource. Thank you very much.